Improvising is hard. You've undoubtedly noticed my various and abundant mistakes if you've managed through the first three episodes. Some are purely grammatical. In my struggles for the right word, I usually lose and succumb for a second or third rate replacement. That probably doesn't actually make sense in that context. I've kind of had a sinking suspicion that in the particularly harrowing bits of chaos and unadulterated fear, I've simply made up words that don't even exist in the English language. If you were to count up the you knows and the ums, you'd probably arrive at a figure rival to the actual contents of the piece. This is okay, at least for me. It's quite possible that you've abandoned this sinking ship entirely for one less made out of sentimentality and shit. What's not okay is the very likelihood that I've given you historical facts that aren't very true or factual. This can happen from time to time, especially in the nitty-gritty specifics beyond the scope of who won World War II. So I'll have to ask you guys to take some of the specifics with a grain of salt. I've kind of... It's interesting when you're speaking with no script in hand. That very first bit ending with salt was all script. And I read it more confidently. And I could just focus purely on elaborating and just reading the text in an aesthetically pleasing manner, an engaging manner, hopefully. As you can tell right now, I obviously do not have a script. The rest of this is pure improvising, but I don't know. I feel like the script bit is overall better, even if less personal. And I urge you as the audience to record your own podcast. You don't even have to post it or you don't have to share it. But I urge you all the same to post your own podcast. Not post, but record for yourself and just see how you fare without a script. See how you fare talking about something that you feel passion for, talking about something you like, and see how much you can just talk about it. With all that having been said, I'll talk about now the real topic at hand, which is the American, in this episode, the American mood, which was no more war. So during World War I, the Americans felt it had been a grave mistake to get involved in the First World War. You could see the reluctance even before the engagement of the First World War. Isolationism. It's really, really ironic because it's isolationism in anything that doesn't involve American interests. The European War involved American interests, but it also involved, to a greater degree, and to a more apparent degree, European interests. And the Americans didn't want to be caught in another European war, and I don't blame them because the Europeans have always been at war. The Allies, Britain and France, were once at war for like a million years. They were at war since the beginning of time, and now they were best buddies. And to this day they are best buddies. But who knows? In the future, there may be another Franco-Anglo war, and the Europeans and their wars sickened the Americans. You could almost argue that the Americans seceded from Great Britain because they were just sick of the European ties, and to an extent you could say they were sick of the European wars. America seceded in part due to a European war, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War in America, the 7 Years' War in Europe, and it just kind of birthed America. So our very conception, the very conception of America was based on another European war, and Americans had had enough. George Washington, one of the greatest American presidents and the first American president, had warned Americans in his farewell address not to be too embroiled in European conflicts and foreign conflicts, right? He wanted America to stay home, make money, be happy, grow some wheat, cut it down, make some bread, feed some people. It would be great. It would be purely American. And no American boys would have to die for a European war. Throughout America's history, but before the point of World War One, there was American imperialism, American expansionism. And you could say, well, this is quite contrary to isolationism. It defies every aspect of isolationist theory, but you have to realize that this was purely in American interests, and there were no other interests of other nations at hand. Every time an American soldier killed another native person of some oppressed nation, you could be sure it was for an American interest, not a European one. So that was, in my mind, what distinguished the carnage of the First World War and, the American expansionism at that point. Another thing about World War One, Wilson had promised America, that the American public at that point, that this war would make the world safe for democracy, because Germany, wasn't fascist, wasn't Nazi, but they were a totalitarian. Well, maybe not that. That's too modern of a term. They were an autocratic regime. They had, Otto von Bismarck and, the leaders of Germany, the Führer or whatever, the high command of Germany, the head of Germany, wasn't democratically elected. There was a lot of royalty in German commanders. There's a lot of emphasis on royal bloodlines. It was kind of like a monarchy, but you have, at the same time, when you look at Great Britain, they were a monarchy. We fought with them. At that time, Great Britain was a parliamentary monarchy. The monarchy strictly existed as a figurehead, kind of by definition purely representative of the appearance of Great Britain beyond the scope of British government. So, but Germany was at that point autocratic, and therefore this war to make the world safe for democracy appeared, which is pretty ironic considering how undemocratic things got in the Second World War, and thus clearly the World War One didn't work. And it was, to begin with, kind of a bullshit line. It was purely sentimental, purely jargonistic, to justify this involvement in the First World War. And people felt like intervention shouldn't be repeated. It was a huge mistake. Look at how many people we lost. Look at the novels and literary works that derived from this terrible, the trenches, the duck boards, the barbed wire, and the poison gas. They were sick of all of it. They'd imagined that the Second World War would be a repeat of the bloodletting and stalemate of the First World War, but it wasn't to be. There would be blitzkrieg later on, and it would be highly mobile, a defense in depth, a mobile defense, a flexible defense, an aggressive lightning attack. There'd be no stalemate. There'd be no trenches this time around. Another factor was the Great Depression. When nearly 1/4 of the people in a nation are unemployed, the prospect of war isn't as exciting, I'd imagine. There's no higher points for the excitement of war when a nation is when a nation is doing well, when a nation is at the peak of its vitality, when the nation is proud and expansive and doing well and the economy is great. But when the economy is in the gutter, then people start to lose interest in foreign wars, especially in another European war, not even a war to protect American interests, but a European war. And the people in the streets didn't want another war. The people in the streets didn't want a repeat. And the Great Depression, everyone thought they should focus on internal affairs. When you see this crisis as big as the Great Depression, some would say the biggest crisis to strike the Americans, since the burning of the White House during the War of 1812, or the American Revolution itself. How could we turn our attention away from that? The Neutrality Acts were conceived as a result of this sentiment. They outlawed the arms sales, the sales of arms and munitions and loans to nations at war, which would quickly be broken with the Lend-Lease program. It also barred Americans from traveling on ships of belligerent powers because the government had learned its lesson from the Lusitania and the passenger lines and Sussex during the First World War, and they didn't want a repeat of this history. That'd be ridiculous. There's a guy, a congressman, or at least a person in government named Louis Ludlow, and I probably butchered his name terribly, but that's what I do. In 1938, he proposed the constitutional amendments requiring a national referendum on any U.S. declaration of war, except in cases of direct attack, which would be, if he got his amendment passed, it would be Pearl Harbor, and that would be the exception. To put that in perspective, if we wanted to change an amendment, something on the Bill of Rights, we would require a national referendum. If we wanted a state to secede, we would have to create a national referendum. And in this case, another thing added to that list would be a formal declaration of war, something the United States has done rarely, but in the same time and in a contradictory way has been constantly at war, but never actively declaring at war. FDR, he rejected it, and he persuaded Congress to reject it because Churchill was pressuring him, and FDR understood the threat of doing nothing. It's almost like the laissez-faire of diplomacy, the laissez-faire of international politics and security, national security, the doing nothing, sticking your head in the sand. It's obviously more complicated than that. And if I were to talk to a widow who lost a son or multiple sons in a war and only received ashes or body parts or a dog tag because there was nothing left to bring back home, or they couldn't get the body back home for whatever reason, or because of wartime necessity, I couldn't even bring myself to be pretentious enough to say what I just said, to say that it was because at this point, Hitler doesn't matter. At this point, to this widow, Hitler doesn't matter. Mussolini doesn't matter. What's going on in China, the rape of Nanking, the invasion of Ethiopia doesn't matter. Because she's lost her entire world. She's lost what amounts to her hopes and dreams in just one quick moment, in one quick motion. And I won't go into details with this, mainly because I don't know this feeling. And, it's just, I feel pretentious to think that I could try to explain it when I don't know it. It's a very bad idea. In 1936, the Olympics were held in Berlin, Nazi Germany. And Hitler was pursuing, at this time, racial purity. He wanted to show the world that the Germans were the superior race. Superior race, better than the Slavs, better than the African Americans, the Africans, not the African Americans because they were just the Africans in Germany. Better than the Jews, better than the Asians, right? Better than everyone because they were the Aryans. They created civilization. They had sophistication beyond the scope of what these other races could have. Arts and aesthetics, they excelled at industry and science. And then, funnily enough, right, um, an African American by the name of Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals and broke or tied 3 world records during this event, right under Hitler's nose. Hitler was, I'd imagine, pretty upset with this. To add on top of that, African American Jew Lewis, um, names, knocked out German fighter Max Schmeling, and again names, in the first round, in the first round of their World Heavyweight Championship fight. Didn't even last beyond that. I don't know anything about wrestling. I'd imagine that would be quite humiliating. But at the same time, as Germany was the host nation, they did win the most gold medals, and the United States, came in a second place, followed by the rest of the usual nations in that order. And it kind of, the purpose, the significance, so to speak, of this Olympic Games was to show to the world that this was the new form of government to model your other governments or aspiring governments. Because before then, it was democracy. Democracy was seen as the default government. And as he showcased this Olympic Games, it was kind of to show to the world that Germany wasn't perhaps as brutal, or that the rumors, which were in fact truths, were not actually real, and that Germany was a clean and beautiful and racially pure and harkening back to tradition, just this perfect nation, this perfect world, this utopia. In violation of the Munich Accords, and this is later on, in 1939, March 15th, the Nazis invaded what remained of Czechoslovakia. And at the same time, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin. Specifically, their diplomats, Molotov, which I think is what the Molotov cocktail was named after, due to the winter wars with the Swedes. And the German diplomat by the name of Ribbentrop. Sorry, that's probably no help to you at all, but the German diplomat and the Russian, the Soviet diplomat, signed a non-aggression pact, and it promised that they would not attack each other. Secretly, the two diplomats also laid out the spheres of influence of each respective country. They would divide Poland after Germany invaded it, and pretty much the start of the Soviet bloc. These Eastern European nations would fall under Soviet control, and everything else to the west would fall under Nazi control. And this was pretty much an insurance for Hitler to go about and do as he pleased. One of Hitler's bigger fears was that, well, clearly not enough to stop him from invading, was that the Soviet Union would interfere in what it saw as a violation of their sphere of influence as their neighboring countries, a threat to their national security, by all means. And as you would see later during Operation Barbarossa and the betrayal of the Soviets by the Germans, these concerns would have been valid, but this was kind of the go-ahead for Hitler to invade the rest of the nations. It's kind of interesting because as much as this was a insurance policy for Hitler, it was an even bigger relief for Stalin. One of Stalin's biggest fears was that Hitler was going to invade his nation, which was a completely justified fear. Stalin saw the capabilities of the German army and the drive that motivated himself in Hitler, kind of like a worthy rival, so to speak. But Stalin would later cling on to this pact desperately, like it was the only thing saving him, not realizing that he was holding on to a lie, a fake promise, an illusion. And Stalin would almost become delusional to the point where during Operation Barbarossa later on, um, he didn't believe reports that the Nazis were invading Soviet territory. Before then, he had given strict orders to his troops not to start anything, not to start a war, not to provoke the Nazis or give them any excuse, which is pretty ridiculous considering that the Nazis, if not given an excuse, would just simply make an excuse like they did with the rest of the nations they invaded in Europe. He ordered his troops, on the border, not to shoot down any German reconnaissance planes that were clearly, scouting out the scene for the battle. And he gave Hitler gifts, not Hitler personally, but the Nazi regime, Nazi Germany, gifts of grain and oil and other materials to finance the war that would later arrive at his doorstep. And in the beginning of the war, and I'm getting off topic again, but mispronouncing things, that's my name, my thing. The Soviet troops on the border, even as the Nazis were invading, wouldn't even fight back in the beginning because they didn't know what to do and they had strict orders not to fight back. But we'll talk more about that later. It's one of the more, to me personally, the more interesting aspects of the war. The bloodiest front in the world. Fascism and American support for the war. In America, you see these sentiments that kind of allied themselves with the Soviets for a time, because it seemed like these Soviets were a socialist paradise, and especially with the workers of the United States who endured these horrible conditions. It was very appealing to hear a nation as powerful as Russia subverted, so to speak, or at least converted in their eyes, subverted to everyone else, by these workers that controlled the nation and distributed wealth and, ensured that no one would ever have to solely endure the burden of the many, and that the burden would be equally shared by everyone, all of the citizens in Russia. And so there was, the American Communist Party, which, all this sentiment quickly dissipated when the Non-Aggression Pact was signed, because then they started to realize and see Stalin's true colors. But there was never that same degree, or virtually no degree of support for fascism in America. And a lot of Americans wanted now to stop the cancerous spread, like the tumor of the fascist regime of the Nazi Reich, and to the lesser extent, the new Roman Empire, or otherwise known as Mussolini's empire. FDR actually sent a list of 31 nations to Germany and Italy to please not invade if you would, so kindly. Apparently Hitler read it, the list out loud, or some American plea, some American diplomatic gesture. He read it out loud at the German parliament, or the equivalent of the German parliament. And they just laughed. In 1938, FDR mobilized. He began to mobilize the military. And, you see this quality of FDR. He's a very insightful and, more importantly, a very prepared man. He can see the clouds on the horizon. He can see the winds of war. He can feel the winds of war. So he asked for a military appropriation of $300 million from Congress, which Congress grants. Furthermore, in the same year, FDR instructs the Air Army Corps to plan an annual production of 20,000 planes. Lastly, in the same year still, it's a very busy year for FDR. FDR establishes a $1.3 billion defense budget for America. That's 1.3 billion in the currency back then. I don't even know how many billions that would be right now. FDR believed, and rightly so, that Germany and Japan would respect force and force alone. Quote, force and force alone. It's a very famous and very astute observation. When a war drags on, there's another point where it's clear that Hitler is winning. Hitler has just taken Paris, and Hitler has consolidated his holdings in Europe. He makes a peace overture to Great Britain, and Churchill, has a similar attitude. And so he rejects it, even though, the Blitz is ongoing and that the British civilians are dying by the tens of thousands to the German Air Force. He realizes that, or he understands what's obvious to us now, that Germany has shown a consistent disrespect for their treaties, and they have no credibility whatsoever. And that's what FDR believed.